Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us from the True Stories collection. Nick has a gray ogre with Lavaspur Boots attached to it. If you've been a fan of the channel for a while now, you know that I like to use grizzly bears as a stand-in for a generic creature with no relevant attributes. But the actual scenario involved a creature with a mana value of 3, so I'm tagging in gray ogre because it has the same mana value, and hopefully that will lead to the least number of people getting confused. Anyway, Amy wants to exile the Grey Ogre with Prismatic Ending. Can she cast her spell with a white mana and a blue mana, and pay for the ward with a red mana in order to make this happen? Alright, so to answer this question, we'll need to take a look at how ward is officially worded in the CR. We can see that the way this mechanic works is that there's a triggered ability that triggers when Amy casts Prismatic Ending, and she needs to pay 1 mana as this ability resolves, or else her spell will be countered. Now that's bad news for Amy because Prismatic Ending only counts the mana spent to cast the spell, i.e. mana that was spent during the process of casting it as a spell. It does not consider mana spent at other times, for example, during the resolution of a triggered ability to stop it from being countered. If you play Vintage, you might recall that it is not possible to spend mana from Mishra's Workshop to buy out of a daze, even if the spell that's getting dazed is an artifact spell. This ruling follows the same logic. And speaking of similar rulings, there's another one this scenario might have reminded you of straight out of the Judge Vault. Let's take the Lavaspur Boots out of the equation and instead say that Amy wanted to cast Prismatic Ending while there was a Thalia out. We'll observe that Thalia says non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. Unlike Ward, this taxing effect actually does affect the mana that was spent to cast Prismatic Ending. Amy could say that she was casting Prismatic Ending with X equals 1 against Nick's Grey Ogre. Then, when the cost to cast the spell was calculated, it would be 1 white mana plus 1 mana for X plus 1 extra mana from Thalia. At this point, Amy could pay 1 white mana, 1 blue mana, and 1 red mana to cast Prismatic Ending, which would then exile Grey Ogre. Another difference between these scenarios is that Ward being a triggered ability that counters the spell affects how it plays with spells that can't be countered. Since Thalia imposes an additional cost, you would still need to pay an extra mana just to get a spell like Abrupt Decay onto the stack. On the other hand, if you use Abrupt Decay against a creature with Ward, there's no reason to pay the ward cost at all, since your removal spell won't be countered either way. Given the similarity of these rulings, I could easily see players conflating them. So what would happen if Amy did not pay an extra mana for ward in the situation from the original problem statement? Well, at a regular relevant, like an F&M, I would probably let Amy take her spell back and recast it if she wanted to add another color of mana. The emphasis for regular rel events is on education and fun, and I think that this ruling is comfortably ahead on both those metrics. The situation would be different if this situation happened at a serious high-stakes Magic tournament, like, I don't know, the Pro Tour. In order to find the correct ruling for a higher rules enforcement level, let's identify what the first time a player did something against the rules was. If we carefully read Amy's spell, we find that it's legal for Prismatic Ending to target any non-land permanent, no matter what its mana value is. Prismatic Ending will just not do anything as it resolves if the targeted permanent's mana value is too high. Now, this means if Amy played Prismatic Ending for a white and a blue mana against the Grey Ogre and then spent a red mana as the ward ability resolved, then Prismatic Ending would not be countered and would resolve normally. Although it would not exile the Grey Ogre because Amy officially only spent 2 colors of mana to cast her spell. This is the technically correct resolution for this scenario as described in the original problem statement. Since Amy has not broken any rules, her play would stand and she would not get a chance to back up. Her spell, all the mana that she spent casting it, as well as buying out of the ward ability, would be lost. Accordingly, if Nick exiled this creature, that would be the time to intervene, because that would be against the rules. Officially, this would fall under a game rule violation, and Amy and Nick would both be assessed a warning for this infraction, since they both share some responsibility for this error. Nick because he physically exiled the creature, and Amy because it was her spell that caused this instruction. But there's another alternative that's worth considering. As we said before, Ward is a triggered ability. And one important fact about triggered abilities is that at competitive and higher rules enforcement level, you're not obligated to remind your opponent about their triggered abilities. Maybe you've heard of Chalice checking before. If your opponent has Chalice of the Void in play, you can cast a spell with whatever mana value it's on and just hope your opponent forgets about it. Now, obviously, you can't rush through resolving it without giving them a chance to point out the spell countering trigger, but likewise, if your opponent does not mention anything about the trigger after you cast the spell, you're good to resolve it. And because I know that people will ask this in the comments, there's a hard line of exactly 1.42069 seconds that you have to wait. And in case you couldn't pick up on it, that's obviously a joke. The actual line is if the judge thinks you waited a reasonable amount of time for the opponent to notice the trigger, which of course isn't a hard line at all, but it's much better that way because the practical considerations of trying to determine exactly how much time actually passed in the game are ridiculous. This is the sort of thing that requires a real person's real judgment. The question of how much time Amy would have to wait before she could comfortably consider the ward trigger missed isn't relevant to the question from our original problem statement, though. Because for that, Amy would cast her spell, and then Nick would either mention his ward trigger or exile his creature, signaling that he had missed it. And so, maybe that interpretation could apply to what happened. Amy spent 3 mana playing the Prismatic ending, and then didn't pay anything for the ward trigger because Nick missed that trigger, and didn't mention it at the appropriate time. In this case, there wouldn't be any penalties for either player because allowing Nick to miss his trigger is allowed for Amy, and there's no penalty for a missed trigger infraction unless the triggered ability is generally considered detrimental for its controller, which ward isn't. Now, given this potential interpretation of what happened, the correct response from a judge would be to say nothing and allow the game to continue, because according to Magic's policy documents, judges should not intervene in cases of a missed trigger unless they intend to issue a warning or believe that a player may be missing their own triggers intentionally, neither of which would be the case here. Now, I know a lot of people tend to disagree with this part of policy. Whenever I make a video and talk about how it's allowed for players to intentionally allow their opponents to miss triggered abilities, there are always comments talking about how stupid this is and how it should be changed. I talked about these concerns in several of my videos, including the ones titled How to Rules Lawyer Your Opponent and the One Ring versus Sun Cleanser. For now, I'll just proceed with the analysis based on the policy that we currently have, leaving any questions related to sportsmanship or ethics to the good people of the comments section. I'm interested to hear your thoughts about what the correct, or at least most desirable, resolution for a situation like this would be. Returning to the focus of what the answer should be based on, rules as written were left with an interesting question. If a judge saw the situation from the original problem statement happen, what would be the appropriate response? And as just discussed, if the missed trigger interpretation is correct, the judge should just let the game continue without intervening. But we said earlier that if the game rule violation interpretation is correct, the judge should stop the players from exiling the Grey Ogre and issue a warning to both of them. So what should the judge actually do? Well, the problem is that the physical actions taken by the players are likely going to be exactly the same for both interpretations. Distinguishing between them would involve analyzing the communication that took place in the game, both verbal and nonverbal, around the time of the play. For example, if either player specifically mentioned the ward trigger in any way or performed some action that would indicate it, such as gesturing towards the Lavaspur Boots, I think that would be pretty strong evidence against the missed trigger interpretation. In the absence of such communication, the missed trigger explanation gains strength. Complicating this is the fact that neither of these interpretations is probably what actually happened. In all likelihood, both players probably thought the ruling with ward worked the same as the ruling with Thalia, and whether they said anything about ward or not, they probably assumed that it counted towards the converge, so it didn't matter either way. Taking all this into consideration, I think that if I saw a player tap only 3 colors to end a Grey Ogre that has ward 1, and the Ogre player exiled it, the answer that fits best with the spirit of the policy that we have would depend on if either player had made any communication of the ward trigger in any way. If not, I think the only policy-supported answer would be to allow the game to continue without intervening. In this case, if a player called a judge later about this issue, I would rule that the trigger has been missed and that we're past the point in the game where we can do anything about it. If either player had demonstrated awareness of the ward trigger and the Grey Ogre player exiled the creature anyway, I would point out that mana spent on that trigger does not contribute towards converge. I think it would be reasonable to allow Amy to take back the casting of her spell, which is the same thing that would happen, for example, if she accidentally tapped too few or the wrong color of mana for a normal spell that she cast. In my mind, this scenario is characteristically similar to the one that we're considering, even if there are technical differences. Still, lines in policy like this one make disallowing Amy from taking back her Prismatic ending a defensible option, so you might see a stricter judge go that route. That's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.